I'm Hannah Weissman, Executive Director of the Magnus Collection of Jewish Art and Life. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. I'm going to keep my own remarks very brief because I know we have a couple of other folks who want to share some remarks before the lecture starts. But I just want to take a moment to thank our partners, the Center for Jewish Studies, and the CJS Anti-Semitism Education Initiative for their partnership on this, as well as the Institute of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. We are always grateful to be in collaboration with our campus partners. I also want to especially thank Jennifer and Greg and Etta and Ethan at the CJS. They are regularly working side by side with us, and we're grateful for that. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Ethan Katz, Faculty Director of the Center for Jewish Studies. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you to the Magnus for hosting us. This is our final major CJS event of the academic year. We benefit so much from our partnership with the Magnus, from many partnerships on campus, but especially from our partnership with the Magnus, and we're very fortunate, and it's always a pleasure to be in this space. So I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's annual Joseph and Ida Pell Lecture, and I'm going to spend a few moments talking about the Pell Lecture and what the Pell family has meant to the Center for Jewish Studies for more than a quarter century now. And if you'll bear with me for a moment, I think by the end you'll understand why this feels so important. The lecture is funded through an endowed fund given in 1997 by Joseph and Ida Pell with the specific purpose of supporting research and teaching on the Holocaust. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the first Pell Lecture that was given in the 1999 to 2000 academic year. And since that time, a number of eminent scholars have come to lecture in the series, including Sam Kassow, Scholl Friedlander, Lisa Leff, Jan Gross, and our own Robert Alter, to name only a few. The fund has made possible a range of events, including a film screening, a one-woman play, and two conferences, one on the legacy of the Nuremberg trials, another on revisiting Freud and Moses. When we launched the Berkeley Anti-Semitism Education Initiative formally in the fall of 2019 in this room with a panel of 4 of our own faculty, that was part 1 of a 6-part series that year on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust funded through the Pell Fund, which culminated with a standing room only crowd of several hundred people watching future anti-Semitism ambassador Deborah Lipstadt on a chilly winter evening that we did not know was only a few weeks before the onset of COVID-19. Since that time, even as we've continued to have this annual lecture as one of our most important events each year, we've also had a yearly series on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust that has been a hallmark of our anti-Semitism education programming and in which the Pell Fund has played a key role. For both Joseph and Ida Pell, supporting Holocaust and anti-Semitism education is a deeply personal investment, and I want to tell you a little bit about their remarkable stories. Joe, as his friends called him, was born Josef Eppelbaum in 1924 in a very small town, Biała Podlaska, in the province of Lublin in central Poland. He was the son of a kosher butcher, and he grew up in a tiny apartment with no electricity or plumbing with his parents and 3 brothers. And Joe and Ida are pictured here in the middle of this family photo that I'll mention again in a few minutes. At the age of 18, when the Nazis were rounding up Jews in the ghetto that had been created around his town, Joe escaped by crawling on his hands and knees into a nearby forest, where he joined a group of pro-Soviet partisans, and in the months to come, they both operated behind enemy lines, disrupting German operations, and saved several hundred civilians. Joe told that riveting story in his award-winning memoir called Taking Risks, A Jewish Youth in the Soviet Partisans and His Unlikely Life in California, which is quite an interesting and entertaining book. After the war, he made his way to America, to San Francisco specifically, where he eventually opened an incredibly successful ice cream shop called Moo's, which some of you probably know. And then he went into real estate development and investing and became, in time, one of the leading real estate developers in Northern California. In the first ice cream shop that he owned in the Sunset District in San Francisco, one day, as he describes in his memoir, in walked a young woman named Ida Kuflik. Like Joe, Ida had come from a traditional Jewish family in Europe. She was born in Cologne on the Rhine in Germany. Neither her parents nor 4 of her siblings survived the war. She and her older sister Henny had been lucky enough to be smuggled into France in 1939. They spent a lot of time in homes run by an organization called the Ozé that basically took care of Jewish children separated from their parents during the war. 2.5 years later, the 2 of them got visas to the United States. Even after that, they came to the West Coast. Life was not easy for them as they grew up here. They bounced around between different homes. And so both Joe and Ida came from families that had lost an enormous amount and carried that sense of loss with them for the rest of their lives, but were very fortunate to have found each other. Joe describes their romance quite movingly in his memoir. He says that when they first met, quote, Ida, with her French and American schooling, love of the arts, and elegant sense of style, helped put me in touch with some of the finer things in life that I had missed during the hectic first years in America. They were married in 1953 and eventually had 4 children, also pictured here, Deborah, Karen, Becky, and David. And Joe repeatedly talks in his book about how important Ida was, not only as his partner and mother to his children and volunteer in various organizations, but really as a partner in his incredibly successful business endeavors. A key moment for him in connecting to his past was in 1993 when he returned to his hometown in Poland with Ida and 2 of their children. And that was actually what prompted him to write his memoir. He had spoken very little about his past up to that time. And it seems to me that it was in the same spirit of education about the past that he and his family generously invested in supporting Jewish studies at Cal, starting with a significant gift that I've already mentioned in 1997. Joe, may his memory be for a blessing, passed away in 2020. Ida is still very much with us, and I've had the distinct pleasure of getting to know her a little bit over the last year. I was delighted to know that she was trying to zoom in, and I hope that you're watching, Ida. So from the time that I came to Cal 7 years ago, I heard a lot about the importance of the Pell family and their generosity to our program. It was thus a tremendous honor and delight for me when Ida expressed interest in giving another major gift about a year ago, and in the summer of 2024, elected to give a $2 million gift to the program to create a chair, an early career faculty chair in Jewish thought called the Ida Pell and Moses David Kuflik Professor of Jewish Thought, named for her and her father of blessed memory. And I was really moved to hear her stories about growing up with traditional Jewish learning around her that clearly shaped a lifelong interest in Jewish thought, in particular in the famous medieval commentator Rashi, who remains a figure of fascination for her. I can't say a lot specifically, but we're very hopeful that this most recent Pell gift will help lead in the coming year or two to a new Jewish faculty member here in the field of Jewish thought, and there's a lot of efforts toward that are already underway. So in light of this most recent gift of the past 25 years of Pell lectures and the extraordinary generosity of the Pell family to our program, I felt it was important to honor them briefly this evening. From my remarks, you can get just a taste of the impact that they have already had on Jewish studies here at Berkeley and of the growing impact that their generosity promises to have on students and community members here for generations to come. So I'd like to give them a round of applause. Turning to this evening's lecture, I could not be more delighted to have as our speaker for this 25th anniversary Pell lecture, Elissa Bemporad, who is a leading scholar of East European Jewish history, of Holocaust history, and the history of anti-Semitism, and comes to us from the CUNY Graduate Center. But I'm going to get out of the way and let my colleague and good friend Roni Maisel do the actual introduction. Roni is Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature and the Norma and Sam Dabby Professor of Jewish Studies here at UC Berkeley. So I'm looking forward to the introduction and then the lecture. Thank you all for coming.
Hi, everyone. I promised to be the last introduction. So Elissa Bemporad is the Unger Professor of East European Jewish History and the Holocaust at Queens College and at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her area of expertise is in the Jews of Russia and Eastern Europe more broadly, with a particular focus on various forms of mass violence and anti-Semitism, especially under the Soviet regime, as well as gendered aspects of the experiences of violence, genocide, and collective and personal trauma. Her scholarship is distinguished by its nuanced attention to how everyday women and men navigate radical political change, as well as its deep and creative archival grounding. Professor Bemporad belongs to a small cohort of scholars who have revolutionized our understanding of the Jewish experience in the Soviet Union, and basically the first cohort to be able to comprehensively and systematically consult the Soviet archives in what now seems like perhaps a too short of a golden age of sorts of relatively free and peaceful movement of peoples and information between some formerly Soviet lands and the West. In this regard, Professor Bemporad's first book, which was titled Becoming Soviet Jews, the Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk, published in 2013 by Indiana University Press, which won the National Jewish Book Award as well as the Frankel Prize in Contemporary History, reshaped our understanding of Jewish experiences in the first decade of the Soviet Union by offering an incredibly rich social history of Minsk in the period, paying attention to how individuals navigated new social, linguistic, gendered, and political landscapes. Rejecting Cold War era views of Soviet Jewish history as one primarily of victimhood, the book foregrounds instead the dynamic shifts in the Sovietization, if that's a word, of Jewish life in Minsk, emphasizing the agency exercised in embracing new ways of life alongside growing centralization and state pressure under the Soviet regime in the late 1920s and 1930s. Her second book, from which I think we're going to be hearing today, is titled Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Lands of the Soviet, published in 2019 by Oxford University Press. This book also won the National Jewish Book Award. And in this book, Professor Bemporad hones in further on that relationship, which I mentioned before, a relationship at times reciprocal, at times contradictory, between ideological discourse and political history on the one hand, and local social history and the lived experience on the other. While the great promise of the new Soviet regime for the Jews and the reason they so eagerly participated in the new state was deeply tied with the Soviet outright disavowal of anti-Semitism, particularly of the blood libel and pogroms, this book shows how both practices, the blood libel and the pogrom, persisted throughout the interwar years and later in the Soviet Union. This stood in contrast with the state's initial desire to quash anti-Semitism and sheds new light on the gradually increasing state indifference to the reality of anti-Semitic violence in the 1940s and onwards. This attention to the gap between formal ideological articulations and lived reality reshapes our understanding both of the Soviet Jewish experience and of the history of anti-Semitism. Professor Bemporad has recently completed another book, which I understand is coming out very soon, is that right? By NYU Press, 2025, and which is said to be the volume 1 of a series titled Jews in the Soviet Union, A History. Her contribution to that is a volume titled Revolution, Civil War, and New Ways of Life, a book which documents and analyzes Jewish cultural, political, and social life in the first decades of the Soviet Union. In addition to her authored books, Elissa Bemporad has also contributed to the fields of Soviet Jewish history, the history of anti-Semitism, and genocide studies, and gender and Jewish studies by editing or co-editing several important and field-defining volumes and special issues in journals. Among those are, I'm going to mention them only in brief, Women in Genocide, Survivors, Victims, Perpetrators, published in 2018 by Indiana University Press, co-edited with Joyce Warren, which created a unique venue to study the gendered experiences of trauma and genocide through an interdisciplinary and comparative view. A special issue of the journal Jewish History from 2020, co-edited with Glenn Dinner, on the topic of Jewish women in modern Eastern and East Central Europe, offered an updated view of the field of gender studies in the context of Eastern European, Jewish Eastern Europe. Another special issue from 2019 of the journal Quest, co-edited with Thomas Chopard, focused on the topic of the pogrom and the Russian Civil War at 100, new trends, new sources, and that opened an important platform for research on this understudied and often neglected episode of violence during the Russian Civil War in the Jewish context from an interdisciplinary approach, including history, literature, cinema, demographics, and more. Yet another special issue, which also came out in 2020, and boy, was that a busy year for you. Co-edited with Julia Cohen and Ari Kelman in Jewish Social Studies, focused on Jewish studies in times of crisis. And while it came out in the midst and in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, it can certainly tell us things about the many ongoing crises that we're living through. Finally, Bemporad is also the co-editor with Eugene Avrutin of Pogroms, a documentary history from 2021, which is an invaluable tool for scholars and students, offering a learned, critical, and document-based understanding of what a pogrom is, what it looks like or looked like as a historical phenomenon from when the term first arises and gains traction in late Tsarist Russia and onwards. So, winner of many prestigious awards and grants, and author of many more influential articles, Elissa Bemporad is a leading scholar of Jewish history and the history of anti-Semitism, and we are especially honored to have her deliver our annual Pell lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Elissa Bemporad.
Thank you so much, Ronnie, for that generous introduction. And yes, Sovietization is a word. Thank you so much to, in particular, to Ethan and Greg for inviting me, and to the Center for Jewish Studies in general. And thank you to the Pell family for their generosity, and thank you to everyone for being here. It is an honor to share with you my work on this Yom HaShoah. Okay, so my goal today is to explore with you the endurance and the permutation of the blood libel. As you know, the blood libel is the false accusation that goes back to the Middle Ages, according to which Jews kill Christian children to use their blood for ritual purposes, primarily as a crucial ingredient for matzah at the time of Passover. And in a way, the accusation of ritual murder is closely connected to the accusation that Jews killed Christ. It is a sort of reenactment of the killing of Christ. So I want to consider today this endurance and the permutation of this myth in the context of World War II and in the immediate years that followed the Holocaust. I will be focusing primarily on the territories of Eastern Europe that were part of the Soviet Union, whether they were part of the Soviet Union since 1922 or after 1939, present-day Belarus and Ukraine. After all, these are the territories where the Holocaust really begun in 1941, when the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa and attacked the USSR during the summer of that year. The decision to carry out what became known as the final solution grew out of the war of extermination launched against the Soviet Union. But before I do that, let me first visually introduce the topic of permutation and then make an observation. To visually introduce the topic, let me show you a painting about ritual murder that does not pertain to World War II, but that captures one of the modern permutations of the accusation, whereby it is not a child who is being murdered, but it is a young woman, as you can see here. The painting, by the way, was commissioned by a Russian aristocrat in 1898. It was publicly put on display in St. Petersburg in 1914. and was discovered in London about 10, 15 years ago. The painting is based on the well-known case, the Tisa Eslar case of blood libel that led to a trial in Austria-Hungary in 1882 and 1883, which involved the disappearance of a young woman, and Jewish men were accused of ritually murdering her. A lengthy trial followed, eventually resulting in the acquittal of the accused. In this painting, I guess we can sense the fear, the anxiety of the Slavic people, of the Slavic nation, embodied by the young woman. And this fear and anxiety materializes through the ritual murder accusation. This is, by the way, a massive painting, 5 meters by 8. Here you also see a detail of the painting, a group of dreadful Jewish vampires who are also rabbis, or they look like religious Jews who could be rabbis, who carry out the ritual by drawing the young woman's blood with a number of sharp instruments, including their teeth. And again, what is interesting here is that the blood libel narrative is further modernized by the addition of an obviously sexual subtext. The naked prey is not only murdered through torture and the drawing out of the blood, she also appears as the potential victim of rape, as ritual murder becomes sexual murder. I wanted to visually introduce a topic to you. It's about persistence of an ancient myth, and it's about the permutation of this ancient myth. That in a way could be reflecting the zeitgeist. Now, the observation, which is necessary in order to appreciate the question of change underwent by the accusation. With few exceptions, under the Soviet regime, the blood libel did not dovetail with the pogrom, with anti-Jewish violence. And at least during the 1920s and 1930s, public attacks and displays of violence against Jews were not tolerated by the state. This attitude on the part of Soviet authorities grows out of the Soviet campaigns against anti-Semitism. Here you see Lenin declaring that the Soviet powers are against anti-Semitism and pogroms. This was celebrated, this opposition against anti-Semitism was celebrated on paper until World War II. Claims of Jewish ritual murder in the Soviet Union did take place. Here, I'm sorry, I was not very wise because I circled the places of the sites, towns and cities where ritual murder accusations occurred in orange, so I'm not sure you can see them, but you can probably see Ukraine up there, and you see these 5 circles up there. So this is also, that's the area of the Pale of Settlement, or the former Pale of Settlement, where the majority of Jews lived. So blood libels did occur, accusations did occur, this is the Pale of Settlement, and these accusations would be followed by criminal investigations and the arrest of those who made the accusations. This did not happen anywhere else in Eastern Europe at the time, where usually, just like the case of Tisa Eslar that I mentioned in relation to the painting, where the accused, the Jews who had been accused, were arrested and put on trial. Unlike Tsarist Russia, and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, the blood libel ceased to be politically and culturally acceptable. And here, I just wanted to show you very quickly a quote that kind of pinpoints how different the approach. Here you have a conservative Russian thinker and what he thinks about the blood libel and how Jews drink our children's blood. And here you have Lenin in 1918 who is condemning the blood libel. So though the blood libel cropped up socially in the Soviet Union, I'm just showing you here some instances from investigations, you know, when Jews were accused of killing Christian children, no trials against Jews accused of committing ritual murder were ever held under the Soviets. I just want to mention one quick example of the Bolshevik commitment to stomping out the blood libel and prosecuting those who made the accusations. And here I will, I will mention the Bailey's affair, which was the most spectacular blood libel in modern Europe, 1911, 1913, when Menachem Mendel Beilis in Tsar's Kiev was accused of killing a Ukrainian boy for ritual needs. Here you see a poster of the Ukrainian boy, and eventually was acquitted on the dubious verdict that left room for much disbelief. But what Lenin did, what the Bolsheviks did as soon as they were in power, in an event of great symbolic significance, they tried and executed the major figures involved in the Bailey's trial. Here you have the trial against Oskar Wipper, who was the chief prosecutor in the Bailey's trial, who is executed by the Revolutionary Tribunal, and Vera Chibiriak, who was actually responsible for the boy's murder, who is shot in downtown Kyiv shortly after the end of the Civil War. And now to our specific topic. Traveling through Ukraine with the victorious Red Army, a Jewish tank commander described what he did not see. Along the Dnipro, from Kyiv to Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia and into Western Ukraine, he encountered no Jews in areas where, before the German invasion of the Soviet Union of 1941, hundreds of thousands had lived. From Kyiv, he wrote, I rode through hundreds of places along the right bank of the Dnipro, but there wasn't a Jew left in any of them, nor did I find any Jews in Zhytomyr, Berdychev, Bila, Tsirkov, or in the thousands of villages and towns we took in Ukraine. There were thousands and thousands of Jews living in these places when the Germans came. As we know, World War II drastically swayed the habits and rhetoric of violence in the German-occupied territories of the Soviet Union during the total ethnic war unleashed in June 1941, in which approximately 1.5 million Jews were killed, most of them in mass shooting operations carried out by the Einsatzgruppen, the German death squads. A revived anti-Bolshevik sentiment quickly came to intersect with wartime anti-Jewish propaganda. And anti-Jewish propaganda from World War II often featured a ritual murder subtext, building on the century-old myth that Jews kill Christian children because they need the blood for ritual purposes. In turn, the blood libel trope drew new inspiration from the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, namely the idea that Soviet communism was really part of a wider Jewish plot to seize power. In a drawing made in November 1941, a worker from Azovstal, Mariupol, depicted Stalin holding a knife in his hand and surrounded by hundreds of skulls. He seemingly built his amateur art on the well-known anti-Bolshevik depictions from the Civil War period, the period that goes from 1917 until 1921, and the Polish-Soviet War of Leon Trotsky, founder of the Red Army, and of course of Jewish background, surrounded by a sea of skulls and bones, blood dripping from his enormous hands or paws, as you can see here, depicted as Satan leading hordes of Asiatic barbarians. This is how the armies that oppose the Bolshevik forces portrayed the Bolsheviks. In the 1941 drawing, again here, the worker portrayed the Soviet leader toiling on behalf of the bloodthirsty Jew as the embodiment of Judeo-Bolshevism. And here you have the quote, "Stalin is the hireling of the Jews. Stalin is the bloody enemy of the people." Now, this is not an iconographic representation of ritual murder, of course, but it does capture the ways in which during World War II, Jews came to be seen as the prime actors of a modern version of ritual murder, this time carried out in the name of communism. At times, Nazi propaganda explicitly encouraged the exploitation of the blood libel theme in conjunction with the Judeo-Bolshevik myth. Ritual murder and communism both embodied the Jewish spirit and lust for power. In the spring of 1942, for example, the Germans executed all the Jews in the small town of Medvin in the Kiev province, accusing them of murdering, for ritual purposes, a Red Army soldier. When the body of the POW was discovered, the Germans spread the blood libel rumor. They staged a trial and sentenced the local Jews to death. Prior to their execution, the victims were tortured. Although there was no immediate reason for the Germans to exploit ritual murder to justify their extermination policy, they still chose to. In 1943, a book on the blood libel entitled Jüdische Ritualmord, or the Jewish ritual murder, was published and distributed in some areas of the German-occupied Soviet territories. The Nazi Party member Helmut Schramm wrote it to promote anti-Bolshevik propaganda and stimulate, in a way, anti-Semitism among those handling the Jewish question. This is the edition from 1944. In the foreword to the book, Johann von Leers, a prominent Third Reich ideologue and professor known for his anti-Jewish polemics, reminded the reader that Judaism was a biologically hereditary form of criminality. The Ukrainian language newspapers published under German occupation can also provide an example of how the blood libel theme was exploited during the war. The August 1943 issue of a Kiev published newspaper featured a detailed analysis of the murder of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. Published on the 25th anniversary of the massacre of Yekaterinburg, as it came to be known, and entitled The Jew's Right Hand, the account presented the assassination of the Tsar's family as a ritual murder carried out by Jewish Bolsheviks. The decision to execute the Tsar, stated the author of the article, was sanctioned by the Jewish Kahal long before the revolution, was carried out by the Zhidok Yankel Sverdlov, one of the most powerful people in the Kremlin under Lenin. The order to execute the Romanov family came directly from Lenin, but the telegram from Moscow with the directive was indeed signed by Sverdlov, who was Jewish and who in 1918 was chairman of the Central Executive Committee of the Congress of Soviets of the Russian SFSR. In its account of the murder, the Ukrainian language newspaper provided the names and ethnicity of the major killers of the Tsar's family, identifying 7 out of 9 as Jewish. In fact, only 2 of the executioners were of Jewish origin. And here you have the quote from the article. What is interesting is that ritual murder accusations turned up even in those regions, such as Central Asia, that did not come under direct German military occupation and were thus removed from vigorous wartime propaganda. Soviet Kyrgyzia or Kyrgyzstan, for example, which saw significant growth in its Jewish population from the small pre-war Bukharan and Ashkenazi communities as thousands of refugees fleeing Nazi-occupied territory settled there, experienced the blood allegation, albeit recast by the new wartime context. The refugees included both Soviet citizens, Jews and non-Jews alike, and Polish Jews. In the summer of 1942, a group of 20 Jewish women, wives of Red Army military personnel who were fighting at the front, addressed a letter to Stalin himself and to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. They complained about anti-Semitism in two cities, Tokmak and Frunze, and they observed that during the days of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, when all people should be always united and engaged in a common effort to strengthen the rear and help the front, here in our cities we observe and experience in person terrible medieval anti-Semitism, accusations that Jews are killing children of other nations, drinking their blood, and using their body parts to make soup. Now, wartime food shortages, rumors about cannibalism on the Eastern Front, hearsay of the blood libel allegation served as the background and perhaps the pretext for these accusations. They were well removed from the more traditional Passover plot, which involved the abduction of Christian children and the use of their blood for religious purposes, in particular for the consumption of matzah. The Jews were killing the children of other nationalities, drinking their blood and using their body parts to make soup is an indicator of the secularization of the blood libel. The food containing human flesh and blood replaced the matzah in a murder that was no longer necessarily ritual in nature, but merely predatory cannibalism. One more observation in parenthesis that seems important relates to the fact that most Soviet Jews were no longer really religious by 1942 as a result of the campaigns against religion carried out systematically in the Soviet Union. The idea that they used blood for a religious ritual like matzah was less plausible. Bloodthirstiness became instead a Jewish ethnic or racial trait rather than a religious one. Now, for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to take you to the beautiful city of Lviv. And I will dwell on one case study that allows us to really zoom in on the impact of the war on the permutation of the blood libel narrative. We are in the summer of 1945. The city of Lviv, which used to be Western Poland, was liberated from the Germans and became part of the Soviet Union, actually became part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And it became the arena of a ritual murder accusation against Jews. According to the allegations, local Jews had kidnapped Polish and Ukrainian children, murdered them, and hidden their corpses within the confines of one of the local synagogues. This is the building of a synagogue, which is still standing today in Lviv. Instigated by the rumors, a crowd of 400 people gathered in the Lviv Krakowski marketplace by the neighboring synagogue on Vuhilna Street, number 3. Yes. And amidst the commotion and a number of physical attacks against Jewish passersby, assertions resounded through the crowd as pogrom talk and the emotions that lead to a pogrom seized everyone. These included statements of disappointment that Hitler had not come to Lviv some 20 years earlier, which would have prevented the Jews from killing children. Some people voiced their rage over the traces of blood of the allegedly murdered children in the synagogue courtyard. Others cried the Jews stole children, slaughtered them, and turned their bodies into food to sell at the marketplace. Without the prompt intervention of the Lviv city police, these accusations most likely would have spiraled into a pogrom. Anti-Jewish violence triggered by blood libel rumors had become somewhat of a common feature in the post-war and post-Holocaust Eastern European landscape immediately following the defeat of the Germans and the establishment of Soviet power. Instances of anti-Jewish violence elicited by false blood allegations occurred in at least a dozen Polish cities and towns from 1945 to 1946. The first one took place in Krakow on August 11, 1945, when Jews were accused of abducting and murdering 13, or perhaps as many as 80, as someone claimed, Christian children and hiding their corpses in the local synagogue. Jewish property came under attack, a fire was set inside the synagogue, and at least one Jew was killed and many wounded. During the pogrom of July 4th, 1946, this image is from this pogrom, which erupted in the city of Kielce, following a ritual murder accusation, 42 Jews were killed and more than 40 were injured, and these were Holocaust survivors. While the Lviv case that I started telling you about shares some similarities with other instances of anti-Jewish violence that occurred in post-war Poland, it also exhibits some distinct features that pertain to the Soviet government's response to the ritual murder accusation, which I mentioned in the first part of my talk. Historically, Lviv was a multi-ethnic city inhabited mostly by Poles and Jews, with a smaller percentage of Ukrainians. Lviv was first occupied by the Soviet Union in the fall of 1939 under the terms of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact of August 23, 1939, and subsequently invaded by the German army in 1941. The events in Lviv also confirmed the changes that occurred in the allegation itself, shedding light on the complicated interplay between the blood libel accusation, World War II, and the newly fragile social environment that emerged in many cities and towns of Eastern Europe, now under communism. The ritual murder accusation that erupted in 1945 in Lviv took place in the wake of the return of hundreds of Jewish refugees, most of them Polish Jews, who had evacuated to Central Asia during the war and who sought repatriation to Poland in 1945. For the Jewish refugees, resettlement came with major obstacles, disappointments, growing tensions with the local population over questions of property restitution, and the psychological trauma stemming from the demise of one of the major centers of Jewish life in pre-Holocaust Europe. Just to remind you, in September 1939, more than 150,000 Jews had lived in Lviv, so 33% of the population, but in the summer of 1944, following the Red Army's liberation of the city, only 2,571 Jews remained. However, the Jewish refugees were also returning to a city in which most of its non-Jewish inhabitants had experienced major violence and an intense ordeal under German occupation, to a city that underwent massive population changes and radical transformations under the newly established Soviet rule. A predominantly Polish city during the interwar period, after 1944, Lviv experienced ruthless Sovietization and ethnic cleansing imposed by Stalin. In the post-war period, the city became predominantly Ukrainian, ethnically and linguistically. Many Jews took shelter in the synagogue building Here, the synagogue, this is today, the synagogue building on Vuhilna Street, one of the few synagogues that are still standing today. From June 14, 1945 to July 15, 1946, the police department, the public prosecutor's office, and the prosecutor's office of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic and the Soviet secret police investigated the accusation that alleged Jews were killing Polish and Ukrainian children in the synagogue and then hiding their bodies in the building's basement. In the report, and here you can read from the report, in the report of the preliminary investigation, the senior investigator stated, as if to reassure the public of the thoroughness and diligence of his search, that not one body was found in the building of the synagogue, nor in the nearby apartments where Jews, including the local rabbi, lived, nor in the basement or cellars, nor in the sewer pipes. No evidence or witnesses of the killing of children in the synagogue was discovered. The police found instead large quantities of chicken feathers and traces of chicken blood or poultry slaughtered according to the Jewish ritual in the synagogue courtyard. The courtyard is right here, still standing. The fact that in 1945, the Jews in Lviv performed ritual slaughter in the synagogue courtyard might have been, at least for some, evocative of an alleged Jewish adeptness with blood rituals and reminiscent of the other alleged Jewish ritual, namely the blood libel. According to the second round of investigations, the accusation originated in the marketplace located next to the synagogue where hundreds had gathered. Here, a group of people chased a Jewish woman through the marketplace and attempted to kill her because, as they shouted, Poles hid you from the Germans and you killed Polish children. Another person involved in the unrest at the marketplace reportedly stated that Jews steal our children, slaughter them, and then turn them into sausages to sell, that the blood of the murdered children in the synagogue is in the synagogue courtyard. And one complainant even tried to encourage the Lviv residents, saying that they should set fire to the synagogue and kill all the Jews because they kill our children, and argued that perhaps as many as 600 children had been, the bodies of 600 children were in the synagogue courtyard. I won't get into the details of the second investigation that is launched by Soviet authorities, just to, to calm down the emotions and to make sure that everyone believes that there are no bodies in the synagogue. But I also want to emphasize here that the secret police eventually arrested 5 people, Ukrainians and Poles. And they were accused of incitement of national hatred against the Jewish people, which, as I showed you earlier, could not be tolerated in the Soviet Union, at least on paper. One of them, in particular, disquieted Soviet authorities. This was 25 years old Ivan Fedak, who had worked for the Germans from 1941 until the Soviets liberated the city, and had served in the police force in Lviv under the Germans, and had also served in the SS division, Galiciina, the German military organization made up of Ukrainian volunteers who helped carrying out the mass shootings operation. There was a trial that confirmed the guilt of these 5 defendants who were charged with counter-revolutionary disturbance and incitement of national hatred against the Jewish people. They were sentenced to 2 years in prison. Just a few observations, and then I will conclude. So, a few observations. First, although there was no direct mention of a specific Jewish religious ritual, the fact that the alleged murders of Polish and Ukrainian children took place within the synagogue implied some ritual aspect of the assumed crime, both for the initiators of the accusation and for the targets of the accusation. The day of the incident, did not coincide with a specific Jewish religious holiday. The Jews who were leaving the synagogue might have assembled there for the customary Thursday morning Torah scroll reading. After all, it was Thursday on June 14, 1945. However, the ritual aspect of the alleged murder is markedly secondary and mostly inferred, it seems. The allegation of cannibalism, on the other hand, spurred by the hunger and miserable conditions that so many had experienced during and after the war, looms prominently. This is a form of cannibalism disconnected from the assumed religious context of Passover. The social memory of widespread cannibalism during the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine of 1932 and 1933, the worst man-made famine in human history. As many as 6 million Ukrainians died of starvation. The siege of Leningrad from 1941 to 1944 might have played a role in the alleged abuse. Moreover, there seems to have been an actual case of cannibalism in Nazi-occupied Lviv. Archival documents mention wartime rumors of human body parts being sold at the city's marketplace, which eventually set off a German investigation that resulted in the arrest of several people involved in the case, since those Jews who had not yet been exterminated by the Germans and their collaborators had no free access to the marketplace. Those arrested were by definition not Jewish. Second observation, while reminiscent of the alleged Jewish practice of religiously driven blood rituals, the Lviv case was also the outcome of wartime violence. Real instances of cannibalism and food shortages removed the blood libel from its ritual aspect and promoted the emergence of a new notion of Jewish murder with no direct mention of ritual. The Lviv case was in this respect not unique. In fact, blaming Jews of committing a modern ritual murder or acts of cannibalism against non-Jewish children and profiteering by selling human flesh at the marketplace occasionally emerged in the immediate post-war months and years. In one instance, in the summer of 1945, in the city of Kryvyi Rih, in the Dnipropetrovsk province of Ukraine, the Soviet secret police arrested a group of Ukrainians and Russians who were distributing flyers accusing an alleged Jewish gang involved in taking Russian children and killing them, and then making sausages and meat pies out of the children's flesh to sell at the market place. My third observation, whether the participants in the Lviv case actually believe that Jews engaged in killing children or not, is really hard to tell. It is, however, noteworthy that they resorted to this specific form of the anti-Semitic accusation as opposed to other expressions. Through the blood libel, the participants in the accusation shared some common knowledge and practices, which they used to reaffirm and perhaps recreate the familiar social order destroyed by the Germans during the war and then wiped out by the new political system, communism. In spite of the growing violence and ethnic cleansing, Poles and Ukrainians found commonalities, perhaps even Christian ones, reinforced by a common Catholic identity to oppose to Russian Orthodoxy, to reject the Soviets. Similar dynamics of a Polish-Ukrainian alliance through anti-Jewish violence had already emerged. After all, in Lviv, during the infamous pogrom of 1941, when thousands of Jews were attacked and murdered in the streets of the city. In 1945, Poles and Ukrainians forged, in a way, a sub-community of common interests and fears that was religiously and culturally based, as well as politically grounded. In this micropolity of anti-Soviet resentment, discussing ritual murder became acceptable for the population, but not necessarily for the state, as the blood libel merged with anti-communist accusations, and the traditional blood libel narrative legitimized the claim of Judeo-Bolshevism. In the minds of many Poles and Ukrainians, the depraved crimes of the Jews and of the communists became intertwined. The inhabitants of newly Sovietized Lviv could now unite and take revenge on Jews who had always engaged in killing their children by means of the traditional blood libel, the new wartime ritual murder, or Judeo-Bolshevism. In the midst of a post-war crisis of identity, borders, and political power, memories of blood libel stories could easily intersect with fears of cannibalism and Judeo-Bolshevism. Finally, this case is interesting because it outlines, it sheds light, it confirms how Soviet authorities changed their mind about anti-Semitism and changed their mind about the culprits in the Lviv affair, which is really symptomatic of how the post-war period for the Soviets was crucial in moving away from the condemnation of anti-Semitism, which was no longer a concern. And actually, the Soviet state would eventually come to, in a way, encourage anti-Semitism. By April 1946, less than 1 year after their arrest, the new head of the prosecutor's office reviewed the case and released the culprits. And he argued that there was lack of evidence. And even though Ivan Fedak, who I mentioned earlier, who had participated in the SS Galiciina and had actively collaborated with Germans, not only undermining Soviet power, but also in killing Jews, the follow-up investigation took his words at face value. He was not guilty of instigating national hatred against the Jewish people and participating in the ritual murder accusation because, as he claimed, he was not present at the time. He was not at the site of the incident when it happened. He said, during that day and at that time, I was in one of the restaurants in the city of Lviv. I even left my watch with the manager. You can ask him. And the way in which Soviet authorities quickly revised their approach to the crime was a strong sign of the times. By late 1946, the Soviets showed little interest in the subject of Nazi collaboration, anti-Semitism, or in stomping out ritual murder and prosecuting those who engaged in the accusation. So in conclusion, we tend to associate the blood libel with the Middle Ages. How was it then possible that this false accusation persisted for so long, undergoing changes over time and in specific contexts? Historian Jonathan Frankel has reminded us that this is not the right question to ask. He criticized the conventional wisdom among historians to focus on the gradual marginalization of the ritual murder charge over the span of the last 350 years. He argued that that was essentially flawed. Instead, Frankel affirmed the importance of seeing the extraordinary vitality of this false myth in modern and in contemporary history. He argued in favor of investigating ritual murder in the context of the modern Jewish experience as a byproduct of modernization, as the outgrowth of the dark side of modern times. And if the irrational is an essential ingredient of modernization, as Frankel argued, then the blood libel could surely become a factor in the hyper-rational, modern, atheistic societies that the Nazis and the Bolsheviks strove to create. Thank you. Questions, comments, clarifications?
Thank you. I'm curious whether you're aware of any conscious or intentional threads between the blood libel, as you've described it, and very contemporary right-wing lunacies like Pizzagate and QAnon? Or is it perhaps just coincidental or something more amorphous that those crazy notions seem to have many consistencies with the blood libel.
Let me ask, I have to say my opinion. Okay. Let me answer that question in the following way. I think that, there are many ways in which I can answer that question, but I'm going to answer it in the following way. In many cases, Jews were accused of this crime as a way to explain events that were unnatural or that were deeply upsetting, like the death of children, the death of, vulnerable members of society. So one example is in 2018, 2018, there was a horrific incident in Siberia, in the city of Kemerovo, where a movie theater, for some reason, there was a fire and 43 children died in this fire. And there were, of course, on the internet primarily, but also on some publications some sites that I follow that are, connected also to the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, that argued immediately that this was a blood libel, that, this is on the eve of Passover, and Jews were probably, this is what Jews do, and they need, they need to murder Christian children in order to abide by their, religious laws. There's one also, in terms of, identifying these kind of continuities. If once you start with the internet, it's basically it's a black hole. But I also want to mention, I'm not addressing your question directly, but I think I am in some way addressing it. The Russian Orthodox Church launched in 1918, with the support of Putin, Vladimir Putin, an investigation to confirm once and for all whether the murder of Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, and his family was indeed a ritual murder or not. Now, the results of this investigation have never been published. I haven't seen anything, and I follow, and I'm curious, and the fact that the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, has launched this investigation is troublesome and telling in many ways.
More questions, comments? While you're all thinking, I'll go ahead and ask a question myself. So thank you for the fascinating lecture. I guess one of my questions is, this seems to be a distinctly Soviet and Russian story in a way. Obviously it links to other, it has things in common with other contexts of blood libel or anti-Semitic accusations elsewhere, but I have the sense that there's ways in which you see this as a really distinctively Russian and Soviet, and then maybe in some ways post-Soviet story, with an example like what you just gave. So I guess I'm just wondering, thinking about the Russian Jewish diaspora and thinking about sort of Russian Jews who went in significant numbers to the United States and to Israel primarily, what you describe seems to me to describe an entire kind of, in a way, history of like mentalité, of a significant number of like a significant portion of the Russian population to have these kinds of perceptions that they go to, right? You said that this was sort of like a natural, like it was telling that people would go to this. It seems telling that Putin has this investigation that he does, that there's a somewhat widespread set of stereotypes that surrounded people in their experience. And I'm just wondering if you see legacies of that sort of in the politics or in the outlook on issues connected to anti-Semitism among the Russian diaspora as they integrated into different societies with, in many ways, very different kinds of political and social experiences.
Okay, the link between the Russian diaspora and this accusation in its Judeo-Bolshevik manifestation is clear in the 1920s and 1930s. When a large number of Russians who supported the white forces fled to France and Germany and influenced significantly, close relationship between some of them and some of the future leaders of the Nazi Party. That's the only, I don't see that elsewhere. I would also like to say that this is not, when you talk about anti-Semitism, you also don't want to generalize and make everyone is anti-Semitic or everyone believes in this accusation. I wouldn't say that there's something inherently Russian, by the way. The blood libel accusation and a whole set of ideas that pertain to folklore and that might touch upon anti-Semitism are deeply embedded, for example, in Lithuania. I would say that in Lithuania, it is very significant. When I was in Vilnius in 2007, when Vilnius was the capital city of European culture, and I was, having a conversation with a colleague who's not Jewish, and she teaches about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and how multicultural, multi-ethnic it was, and she talks about Christianity, Judaism, and also Islam through the experience of Tatars, and she said, it was Passover, and I thought I would bring some matzah to class because, it's not like in New York where you walk into a CVS and there's matzah. And this is Vilnius University. This is the capital city of European culture. And of the 40 students, only 2 tasted the matzah because they've heard that there might be some blood. And Christian blood. And by the way, there are there has been some ethnographic work that has been done on the ground in some areas of Western Ukraine. So that's not Russia, and some areas of Poland also, where the accusation has again changed. Jews no longer kill Christian children, but they draw some blood. They have a way to have some, because the matzah is not matzah unless there is a drop of blood. So yeah, that's my answer to your question.
Thank you. You've presented this as a modern story. I mean, and the dating and the chronology would affirm that, of course. But I'm curious. The earliest blood libel you mentioned is the Baylis case. But I'm curious to know. I'm curious to know how prevalent the blood libel was after the first partition of Poland and Russia gets its first Jews. So between that time and then, let's say, up to Baylis, how prevalent was the blood libel there? Or is it indeed a modern phenomenon in the Slavic lands and Russia in particular?
Yeah, thank you. I use the term modern, I guess, rather loosely without defining exactly what I mean chronologically speaking. There are a few cases in the 19th century in Russia, the case of Saratov, for example. I would say that I wouldn't say that it explodes in the context of late imperial Russia, but we definitely hear more about these instances, especially the Baylis affair. But just if we think about, Dostoevsky wrote in the diary of a writer that, there were sects of Jews, and this is long before the Baylis affair, sects of Jews who, did engage in ritual murder at least once a year. And Nicholas II also did believe in the blood. So it becomes, in a way, it becomes culturally acceptable. But how it intersects with the politics, I mean, I guess my story picks up from where Magda Teter leaves off, right? At the end of the 18th century. I have to think more about that. But thank you for the question.
Other questions or comments? Okay, if I'm not seeing any, let's just give our speaker one last round of applause. Thank you so much.